The year was 1872, and the high desert of New Mexico was a harsh place to be anything, let alone an orphan. Prospect Hollow was not a town. It was a scar on the land, a handful of leaning structures huddled together for protection against the wind, the heat, and the silence. It was a place where hope came to die, and where Finian Ward, at 11 years old, had learned to live on the scraps of that death. He was a boy made of periphery, existing in the slivers of shade by the saloon wall, in the dust cloud behind the freight wagon, in the cold corner of the stable loft. He worked for his keep at the livery, living on the mercy of the settlement and the leftover heels of bread or cold beans passed to him by the saloon cook. He was accustomed to the sharp sting of a shouted word. Every man in Prospect Hollow seemed to speak to him in barks and commands, but no one ever struck him. It was not out of kindness. It was, perhaps, that he was too thin, too quiet, too much like a stray coyote pup that one curses at but does not bother to kick. To strike him would be to acknowledge him, and Finian was, above all, meant to be ignored. His master, if the word applied to a boy paid in scraps, was Malcolm Fitch. Fitch ran the livery stable with a cold, economical fury. He was a man dried out by the sun, his skin like old leather, his eyes the color of the alkali flats. He did not see Finian as a boy. He saw him and often referred to him as cheap hands. From the first gray hint of dawn, when the air was still sharp and cold enough to sting his lungs, Finian was hauling water from the deep well, the rope biting into his small palms. He mucked out the stalls, the smell of ammonia and horse sweat clinging to his thin clothes. He polished tack until his fingers were raw and brushed down horses that stood taller than he was, their massive bodies radiating a heat he craved. He worked until the last light faded from the sky, until his back was a single, dull ache and his legs trembled. Every day was the same, and every day ended with the same implicit threat from Fitch. Any slowness, any dropped bucket or forgotten latch, was met with the same cold promise. "There's plenty of desert out there, boy. You slow me down, you can go live in it." Finian understood the desert. It was the space between breathing and starving. But the desert held more than just starvation. It held the Apache. Finian Ward had been raised on stories of their brutality. In the small, unpainted church on Sundays, the preacher spoke of them as heathens, as the shadow of God's wrath given form, souls lost to the wilderness. In the saloon, where Finian sometimes swept the floors for a slice of stale pie, he heard the other stories. Men made brave by whiskey, spoke of distant homesteads burned to the ground, of travelers who simply vanished between one mesa and the next. They were described not as men, but as a force, like a wildfire or a flash flood. He was taught to fear them, to equate their name with the sharp, metallic smell of blood and the greasy black smoke of ruin. He was taught to run. One evening, the sun was beginning to bleed into the western mesas, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and violent orange. The heat of the day was just beginning to break, but the air remained still, trapping the dust. Fitch emerged from the tack room, wiping grease from his hands onto an already filthy rag. He squinted at Finian, who was struggling to roll a heavy barrel of oats. "Leave it," Fitch commanded. His voice was flat, like stones skipping on dry dirt. He tossed a dented metal canteen at the boy's feet. It clattered loudly in the quiet stable yard. "The creek water barrel is low. Get to Ashwind Creek and fill that, and be quick about it." Finian picked up the canteen. Ashwind Creek was nearly a mile away, up through the sparse pine hills. Going there now meant coming back in the dark. Fitch seemed to read his hesitation. The man's thin lips barely moved. "You're back before the moon clears the ridge, or you don't bother coming back at all. I got no use for hands that can't handle the dark." Finian said nothing. He just nodded, his throat tight, and clutching the canteen. He ran. He moved quickly, his bare feet knowing the path, dodging the sharp spines of hedgehog cactus and the grasping branches of mesquite. He crossed the dry wash and climbed into the low hills, where the air grew sharper with the scent of pine resin, the red dust, fine as flour, puffed up around his ankles with every step. Up here, the silence was different. It was not the empty silence of the stable yard, but a thick, heavy silence that felt like cotton pressed against his ears. It was a listening silence. He reached Ashwind Creek, a thin ribbon of water that tumbled down from the higher rocks, carving a small, green sanctuary in the dry land. He knelt by the bank, the cool mud squeezing between his toes, and dipped the canteen into the water. The sound of the gurgling water filling the meadow was a comfort. And then he heard it. It was not the sound of the creek. It was not the rustle of a lizard or the call of a nighthawk. It was a breath, a wet, ragged, hitching sound that stopped and started, like a broken bellows. It was too rough to be an animal, too weak to be one of the drunken prospectors who sometimes stumbled out of the hollow. He froze. Every story he had ever heard clamped down on his heart. The Apache, the scalp hunters, the shadows that moved without sound. His first instinct was to rise slowly, grab the full canteen, and run until his lungs burned. He should return to Fitch, even if it meant sleeping without supper for being slow. But he did not move. The sound came again, a low, rasping groan that seemed to be pulled from the very bottom of a man's chest. Curiosity, or perhaps a loneliness so deep it recognized another's, won out over the fear. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but he found himself standing, leaving the canteen by the water's edge, and creeping toward the sound. He pushed aside a curtain of dry juniper, his movements small and silent. He slipped between two large sandstone boulders, the rock still warm for the day's sun, and he found him. A man lay on his back, wedged between the rocks and a large patch of prickly pear. He was Apache. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the copper skin now slick with a sheen of cold sweat, or the long black hair fanned out in the red dirt. His buckskin shirt was torn open at the chest, not by a bullet or a knife, but by claws. 4 deep, parallel gashes ran from his shoulder to his ribs, caked with dried blood and dirt. A mountain lion, Finian thought, his stomach turning. The man's back was caked in the same red earth, as if he had dragged himself here. One hand was pressed tight to the terrible wound on his chest. The other was outstretched, fingers spread wide, reaching toward the sound of the creek just 20 yards away. Finian stood paralyzed, hidden by the bush. He watched as the man's chest struggled for another breath. He thought the man was unconscious, or perhaps already dead. Then the eyes opened. They were black, and even in the deepening twilight, they seemed to burn with a tired, defiant light. They found Finian instantly. The warrior did not startle. He simply stared, his gaze locking onto the small, terrified boy. The man's breath hissed through his teeth. His lips, cracked and gray, parted. He spoke, but the sounds were not words Finian knew. They were guttural and soft, like the sound of wind rushing through a high, narrow canyon. Finian remained frozen, unable to look away. The warrior's outstretched hand, the one reaching for the water, trembled. With an effort that seemed to take all his remaining strength, the man slowly lifted the hand, touched his own throat, and then, his eyes never leaving Finian's, he pointed, not at Finian, but past him, toward the dented canteen sitting by the creek. Finian's mind was a storm of voices, the preacher's warnings, Fitch's cruelties, the saloon stories of burning wagons. This was the enemy. This was the man who, if he were healthy, would supposedly kill him without a thought. All he had to do was back away. The man was dying. The desert, the mountain lion, had already done the work. He could just leave, get the water, and run back to the hollow. But the voices in his head went quiet, replaced by the simple, terrible reality in front of him. The man's eyes. He was not looking at Finian as an enemy. He was not looking at him as a white boy. He was just a man, looking at another living thing, asking for water. He was dying. He was thirsty. And he was completely, utterly alone. In that moment, Finian saw a reflection of himself. He saw the same isolation he felt every morning in the cold stable, the same desperation. This man was just another version of himself, left to die in the dust. His terror did not vanish. But something else rose up beside it. He was trembling, terrified that Fitch would appear, or another settler, or worse, other Apache. But he stepped out from the cover of the juniper. He walked back to the creek, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He picked up the full, heavy canteen. He turned and walked back to the dying warrior. Finian knelt in the red dirt beside the man. The smell of blood and sweat was strong. The man's eyes followed him, watchful, exhausted. Slowly, his hands shaking so much he almost dropped the canteen. Finian uncapped it. He carefully lifted the warrior's head with one hand. It was heavy, the skin hot and dry, and with the other, he brought the dented metal lip to the man's mouth. He tilted it gently. Water spilled over the man's chin, but he swallowed, a desperate, rasping sound in his throat. He drank and drank, his hand weakly coming up to grip Finian's wrist. It was not a grip of strength, but of desperation. Finian held the canteen steady until the man turned his head away, his breathing coming a little easier. He laid the man's head back down on the dirt. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sky was dark purple, and the first stars were appearing. Finian Ward, the 11-year-old orphan, had just given water to his mortal enemy. It was the first true act of defiance in his life, a moment of compassion that went against every story he had ever been told. And he did not know that this simple act, this stolen water in a dented canteen, had just sealed his fate. The water calmed the man's breathing, but only for a moment. The terrible, ragged sound soon returned, and a tremor ran through his body. He was cold. Even in the mild New Mexico twilight, he was shivering, his skin clammy. He tried to speak again, and this time Finian leaned closer, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a desperate need to understand. "Cold," the man whispered, the English word broken, almost unrecognizable. "Weak, many suns." He closed his eyes, his strength failing, and lapsed back into his own tongue, a string of soft, guttural sounds that sounded to Finn like stones rolling in the creek bed. "Many suns," Finian repeated to himself. He understood. The man had been here for days. The boy's eyes traced the man's form in the growing darkness. He saw the simple necklace of carved bones around his throat. And he saw the other wound. The gashes from the big cat were horrifying, a brutal tearing of flesh. But high on the man's left shoulder, partially hidden by the torn buckskin, was something else. It was a small, dark hole, perfectly round. The skin around it purpled and swollen. It was not the work of a lion, it was a bullet hole. This man had not just been mauled by an animal. He had been shot first, shot by a white man, and had fled, wounded, only to be attacked again by a predator. The realization settled in Finian's stomach like a cold stone. This was more complicated than a simple accident in the wilderness. The warrior's eyes remained closed. Finian knew he had to leave. The moon was already a pale sliver rising over the eastern ridge. He was late, terribly late. He scrambled back to the creek, dunked the canteen to fill it, and ran. He did not look back. He ran with the reckless speed of terror, imagining Fitch's face, imagining the Apache warrior dying alone, imagining the bullet hole. He burst out of the pine hills and sprinted across the open ground to the stable, the heavy canteen banging against his hip. Malcolm Fitch was waiting for him in the stable yard, a single lantern hanging from a beam, casting long, distorted shadows. He was wiping down a bridle, but his movements were stiff with anger. "The moon's clear, boy," Fitch said. His voice was not loud. It was worse. It was a low, flat scrape. Finian panted, his chest aching. "I'm sorry, Mr. Fitch. I slipped by the rocks and dropped the canteen. Had to fill it again." It was a thin, breathless lie, and the taste of it was sour in his mouth. Fitch did not look at him. He continued to polish the brass buckle on the bridle, his knuckles white. "You're late. You cost me. You cost me time, and you cost me lamp oil." He finally turned, his eyes invisible in the shadow of his hat brim. "You're just a mouth to feed, boy. A mouth that I can stop feeding any time I choose. There ain't no one in this territory who's gonna miss you." He gestured with his chin toward the vast, dark desert stretching out beyond the hollow. "You make me wait again. You're out. Not 1 cent in your pocket. You'll be chewing on cactus and begging the buzzards for shade. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Finian whispered, his head down. The fear of that empty, starving darkness was total. It erased all other thoughts. He swallowed the secret of the warrior, locking it down deep in his gut. "Get the water barrel filled, then get to the loft. Don't want to see your face again till sunup." Finian hurried to empty the canteen into the barrel, his hands shaking. He did his work and then scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft. His only home. He did not have a bed, just a corner where the hay was thickest, and a single, moth-eaten horse blanket. He lay down, but he did not sleep. He stared at the cracks in the roof, listening to the horses shifting and blowing in the stalls below. He heard the saloon's piano, tinny and distant, and he heard the warrior's breathing, the word cold echoing in his mind. Water was not enough. He knew it. The man was bleeding, and he was starving. An hour passed. The saloon quieted. The light in Fitch's small office went out. The stable was dark, save for the pale shafts of moonlight cutting through the planking. Finian moved. He slipped down the ladder, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. He did not go toward the door. He went to the tack room. In the back corner, under a pile of old saddles, was a trap door. He lifted it. Cold, damp air rose to meet him. It was the root cellar, a small, dark hole dug into the earth where Fitch kept potatoes, onions, and other supplies that needed to stay. Finian descended the rungs. The smell of damp soil and burlap was thick. In the corner, on a low shelf, sat a large tin pitcher, sweating with condensation. It was milk, fresh from the dairy ranch 10 miles north. Fitch bought it, not for himself, and certainly not for Finian. He fed it, mixed with oats, to his weakest horses, the ones he was trying to fatten up for sale. It was precious. It was medicine. Finian stared at it. Stealing food was one thing. He sometimes palmed a biscuit when the cook was not looking. But this was different. This was stealing medicine. This was stealing Fitch's profit. This was the one act that would get him thrown out into the desert without a second thought. His fear of Fitch was a physical thing, a cold knot in his belly. But the image of the man's eyes, the way he had looked when he swallowed the water, was stronger. The thought of him dying alone, of anyone dying that alone, was something Finian could not bear. He, too, was alone. In this dark cellar, he felt a kinship with the dying man that was stronger than his fear. His heart hammered against his ribs, the sound booming in the tiny space. He looked around frantically. On a high shelf, covered in dust, was an old tin cup, bent and rusted at the handle. His hand trembled as he reached for the pitcher. The metal was cold. He dipped the cup in, the clink of the cup against the pitcher's rim sounding as loud as a gunshot. He froze, listening. Above, he heard Fitch snore, a low, sawing sound. He filled the cup to the brim. The milk was rich and white. He had not tasted milk in years. He held the cup in both hands. He had to get it out of the stable without being seen. He carefully pulled his oversized shirt free from his trousers. Holding his breath, he slipped the cup inside, pressing it flat against his stomach. The cold milk sloshed, shocking his skin. He climbed the ladder, his movements stiff, trying not to spill a drop. He eased the trapdoor shut. He stood in the tack room, listening. Only the snores. He stepped out onto the stable floor. The dirt was packed hard, but a few loose pebbles skittered under his feet. He walked slowly, woodenly, his arms clamped to his sides, his stomach muscles tight to keep the cup balanced. Every creak of the old stable seemed to scream thief. He passed the stall of Fitch's own gelding. The horse shifted, snorted, and banged a hoof against the wood. Finian froze. He heard Fitch grunt and roll over in his cot. The snoring stopped. Finian did not breathe. He waited. 1 second, 2, 5. Then the snoring resumed, louder than before. He let out his breath in a silent rush and slipped out the side door, a shadow moving into the moonlight. The second journey to Ashwind Creek was a nightmare. He was no longer just a boy out too late. He was a thief, carrying aid to the enemy. If any white man from the hollows saw him, he would be whipped. Maybe worse. And if the Apaches he had been taught to fear were still out there. He held the cup steady with one hand, pressing it to his ribs. The cold had numbed his skin. He moved through the pines, his senses screaming. Every snap of a twig was a rifle being cocked. Every shadow was a warrior waiting in ambush. He imagined the girl on the pinto horse, her eyes watching him from every dark patch. He finally reached the clearing. He was panting, half from the run, half from pure terror. He found the man. He was still alive, but his breathing was shallower, a faint whisper in the quiet. Finian thought for a terrible second that he was too late. "Sir," he whispered, touching the man's shoulder. The warrior's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, distant. Finian pulled the tin cup from his shirt. It was only half full now. He had spilled much of it on the frantic journey, but it was something. "I brought milk," he said, his voice shaking. He lifted the man's head again, more confidently this time. He pressed the rim of the cup to the cracked lips. The man's eyes widened, just slightly, as he tasted it. He swallowed. It was not the desperate gulping of the water. It was a slow, deliberate act. He drank every drop, his throat working. When the cup was empty, he let out a long, sighing breath, a sound of profound relief. The warrior's eyes cleared. The cloudiness faded, and they focused on Finian with a burning intensity. He seemed to gather the last of his strength. His hand, no longer trembling, rose. He touched his own chest. His fingers splayed over his heart. He spoke one word, his voice a low, clear whisper. "Tahoe!" He paused, then spoke it again, breathing it out like a prayer. "Tahoe!" Then his fingers, dark with his own dried blood, moved. They left his chest and came to rest on Finian's, right in the center of his thin, milk-stained shirt. He pressed, just gently, as if leaving a mark. "Tahoe," he said, for the third and final time. Finian looked down at the hand on his chest, then back to the man's eyes. He did not understand the word. Was it the man's name? Was it a word for thank you? Or brother? It felt heavier than a name. It felt like an oath, a transfer. "Tahoe," Finian repeated. His own voice was small, but the word felt solid in his mouth. In that instant, a bridge was built across the silence, the fear and the blood. A soft sound, the shush of a horse stepping on sand, made Finian's head snap up. He was not afraid this time. He was expecting it. On the ridge above, silhouetted against the bright, starry sky, the riders were back. They were closer now. He could count them. 10, maybe more. They sat on their ponies, silent as the stones around them. He saw the pinto horse. He saw the slender rider with the long braids. The girl. She was watching him. Her gaze was fixed. Not on the dying man, but on Finian. On the empty tin cup he still held in his hand. Her face was impossible to read in the darkness, but he could feel her surprise, her confusion. The riders did not move. They did not raise a weapon. They just watched. Finian looked from the riders to the warrior and back again. He laid the man's head gently back on the earth, placing the empty tin cup beside his outstretched hand. He stood up slowly. He did not run. He held the gaze of the girl on the pinto for one moment longer. Then he turned and walked, not ran, back into the cover of the pines. He walked all the way back to the stable, a strange, quiet warmth spreading from the spot on his chest where the warrior's hand had rested. He was still terrified, but he was no longer alone. He did not know that he had just fed the son of a great chief. He did not know that the girl, Mara, was the warrior's sister. He did not know that his theft of a half cup of milk had sealed his fate, binding him to a tribe and a promise he could not yet understand. He just climbed back into the hayloft, curled up, and for the first time in his life, slept without dreaming. The secret forged a new rhythm in Finian's life. By day, he was the same thin shadow, hauling water and mucking stalls. enduring the flat, cold gaze of Malcolm Fitch. But by night, he was a thief and a provider. The trips to the root cellar became a nightly ritual of terror. He would wait until Fitch's snores were a steady, sawing rhythm in the small office off the stable. Then he would lift the heavy trap door. The pitcher of milk was a white beacon in the damp darkness. He never took much. He learned to dip his tin cup just deep enough to fill it, leaving a loss so small it could be blamed on a heavy-handed pour or a thirsty barn cat. Each time, his heart was a cold fist in his chest. Every drop of milk he carried out was a sin against his master, an act that would see him cast out into the desert without a scrap of food or a cent to his name. But he also knew, with a certainty that defied his fear, that every drop was another few hours of life for the man by the creek. He brought more than milk. When the saloon cook threw out a half loaf of stale bread, Finian snatched it. He saved a bruised apple that had rolled from a feed sack. He carried these offerings in his shirt, feeling like a criminal, but also feeling, for the first time, a purpose that was entirely his own. Tahoe, as Finian now called him in his mind, was weaker, but his eyes were clearer. The milk and water, the small bites of bread Finian broke and softened in the water, were holding death at bay. Just barely, in those brief, stolen moments in the twilight. Tahoe spoke. His strength would come in short, weak bursts. Finian, kneeling beside him, would lean close to hear the words, whispered past cracked lips. "Bad," Tahoe breathed, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "Bad white man." Finian did not know what to say. He just listened. "Big cattle?" Tahoe whispered, his hand moving weakly toward the south. Crowley. The name meant nothing to Finian. It was just a sound. But Tahoe repeated it, and a flicker of that old, burning light returned to his eyes. "Harlan Crowley. Shot." He touched his shoulder, the spot where Finian had seen the small, dark hole. "My land. He shot." The fragments pieced themselves together in Finian's mind. A rich white man named Crowley, a man with big herds of cattle, had shot Tahoe for defending his land. The story he had heard in the saloon, of brave settlers and savage Apaches, suddenly twisted, turning inside out. The man in front of him was not a random savage. He was a man who had been shot in the back, or at least from a distance, and left to die, only to be found by a lion. The injustice of it settled on Finian, heavier than his fear of Fitch. On Sunday, the bell of the small, unpainted church in Prospect Hollow rang its tinny, cracked call. Finian sat in the last pew, as he always did, feeling small and separate. The air was thick with the smell of old wax, cheap soap, and the dust that filtered in through the warped window frames. The preacher, a thin, nervous man with a voice that was always too loud for the small room, stood at the pulpit. He did not speak of forgiveness today. He spoke of fear. "Word has come from the east," he announced, his eyes scanning the sparse congregation. "There are signs, shod pony tracks, Apache signs, have been found north of the ridge." A low murmur rippled through the pews. A woman clutched the child on her lap. "The settlement is on alert," the preacher continued. "I am telling you all, as your spiritual shepherd, do not stray. Do not leave the boundaries of the hollow. Do not travel alone, and do not travel at night. We must be vigilant." Finian felt his blood run cold. He stared at the flickering candle by the pulpit, its flame bending in a draught. He was the one straying. He was the one traveling at night. The secret he carried felt like a physical weight under his shirt, a hot, burning coal. He felt the eyes of the townsfolk, though no one was looking at him. He was a traitor in the house of God, his secret growing larger and more dangerous in the flickering, holy light. He could not stop. The preacher's warning only made his nightly journey more urgent. He knew, with a child's simple, terrible logic, that Tahoe's time was running out. It was the 7th night since he had first given the warrior water. 7 suns. The moon was a fragile, white sliver, casting a pale, ghostly light that made the familiar pines look like skeletons. The air was still, holding its breath. He went to the cellar one last time. He filled the tin cup. He had also managed to hide a thick piece of hard bread from the church supper, a rare treat. He tucked it inside his shirt, the cup of milk in one hand, and slipped out of the stable. The walk was different. The silence of the hills was no longer just quiet. It was watchful. He expected a hand to fall on his shoulder at any moment, either a settler from the hollow or a painted Apache warrior. He reached the clearing, his breath misting in the cool air. He found Tahoe. The man was lying flat, his arms at his sides. He was so still that Finian thought he was already dead. The cup and apple from the day before lay untouched. "Tahoe," Finian whispered, his voice catching. He knelt and touched the man's shoulder. The skin was cold. "Tahoe." The man's eyes opened, but only barely. They were filmed over, and he seemed to be looking past Finian, at the sliver of moon. He was too weak to lift his head, too weak to drink. Finian set the milk down. He broke a piece of the bread and dipped it in the water from his own canteen, trying to soften it. But Tahoe turned his head away. A faint, rattling breath escaped the man's chest. He focused, with a terrible, final effort, on Finian's face. His hand, as light as a dry leaf, lifted. It brushed Finian's cheek. A smile, barely a quiver of the lips, touched the man's face. "7 sons," he whispered. The words were a dry rustle, but they were clear. "Warriors come." His gaze held Finian's. "Remember heart." The man's hand fumbled, moving from Finian's face to his own neck. He grasped the simple thong of hide and bone. He tried to pull it, but his fingers were weak. Finian understood. He gently lifted the man's head and untied the knot. Tahoe took the necklace. He did not drop it. He held it up, his arm shaking, and draped it over Finian's head. The carved bone settled around Finian's neck, cool against his skin, heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with their size. Then, Tahoe laid his hand flat on Finian's chest, over his heart, just as he had done that first night. He pressed, a faint but deliberate pressure, a seal, a mark, a transfer. His hand remained there. His eyes, fixed on Finian's, lost their focus. A long, slow breath eased out of him, and he did not take another. He was gone. Finian knelt in the silence, the cold hand of the dead warrior resting on his heart. The silence of the pines, the creek, the stars, rushed in. He was alone, truly alone this time. The weight of the hand on his chest felt like the weight of the entire sky. He gently, carefully, lifted the hand and laid it on the man's stomach, next to his other one. He sat back on his heels, the cold of the ground seeping into him. He could not leave him. He could not let the coyotes find him, or the buzzards in the morning. He thought of the lion that had torn his chest. He would not let this man's body be dishonored again. He had no shovel. He looked around wildly, his eyes stinging. He went to the creek and found a large, flat piece of shale, its edge almost sharp. He went back to the body. He began to dig. He dug in the hard, rocky soil beside the man, using the flat stone as a spade. When the stone broke, he used his bare hands. The dry earth was like iron, packed with roots and rocks. He tore at it, his fingernails breaking, his palms scraping raw. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, his breath coming in sobs. His fingers were bleeding, the warm sting a strange contrast to the cold night, but he did not stop. It was not the beating he had always feared from Fitch. This was a pain he had chosen, a debt he was paying. It was a shallow grave, barely 2 feet deep, but it was the best he could do. It had taken him hours. The moon was high and bright. He was careful. He gently rolled Tahoe's body into the hollow. He straightened his limbs and folded his hands, the way he had seen the undertaker do with a dead prospector once. He closed the man's eyes. He stood for a moment, looking down. Then he began to push the earth back, his raw hands burning. He covered the man completely, patting the mound of fresh dirt until it was smooth. It looked small. It looked wrong. Just a pile of dirt. He went to the creek. He began gathering stones, the smooth, round stones from the water's edge. He carried them, his arms aching, his hands stinging. He placed them one by one. forming a perfect, tight circle around the grave. He ringed it until the fresh earth was contained, protected. It was better, but it still felt incomplete. He looked up, past the pines, to the west. The last faint glow of the sunset had long since vanished, but he knew the direction. He guessed that was where Tahoe's people lived. It felt right. He searched the creek bed again, finding long, flat stones. He carried them and laid them in a single, straight line, starting from the edge of the circle and pointing due west, a path, a way home. He thought it looked proper, finished. He was exhausted. His hands were caked in his own blood and the red earth. He stood back and looked at his work, a circle of stones and a path to the west, shining pale and clean in the ghostly moonlight. He tried to remember a prayer. The words from the church felt jumbled and wrong. "Our Father," he whispered, his voice rough. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. God rest his soul." He turned and walked away, his hand clutching the bone necklace under his shirt. He did not look back again. He did not know that he had, in his childish innocence, performed a sacred burial. He did not know that the circle of stones was a sign of honor, a mark of a warrior laid to rest by a friend. He did not know that the line of stones pointing west was not just a guess, but a clear, unmistakable message to any Apache who would find it. His spirit is not lost. He is returning to us. Tahoe had whispered 7 sons. 7 more suns would rise and set, and in that time, the news of this grave, this message in stone, would travel on the wind, carried by silent scouts to the high fortified stronghold of Thunder Mesa. It would reach a grieving father and a sister with watchful eyes, and it would be heard by nearly 400 warriors who were already preparing for a war and who now had a new, sacred duty to fulfill. It was a week later. 7 suns had risen and set since Finian had patted down the earth over Tahoe's grave. The secret of the bone necklace, hidden beneath his shirt, had begun to feel like a part of his own skin. His hands, no longer raw, had healed, but the memory of the digging remained. Life in Prospect Hollow had settled back into its dull, grinding routine. The preacher's warning about Apache signs had faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of dry wells and thin cattle. Finian was in the stable, sweeping a cloud of golden dust and straw from the main aisle. The mid-morning sun was hot, and the air was thick with the familiar smell of hay, horse, and leather. He was thinking of nothing, his mind as empty as the dust motes dancing in the light. Then the church bell rang. It was not the slow, measured peal for Sunday service. It was not the solemn toll for a funeral. It was a frantic, desperate, hammering clang, one note falling over the last, a sound of pure panic. It was the fire alarm, the sound that meant the end of the world. Finian dropped his broom. He heard a door slam, then a shout. From the livery doorway, he saw people spilling out of the saloon and the general store, their faces pale and confused. Men ran into the street without their hats. Women held their hands to their mouths, shading their eyes. They were all looking in one direction, north, toward Thunder Mesa. Finian ran out into the dusty street, his heart leaping into his throat. He followed their gaze. The ridge, usually a simple brown line against the blue sky, was different. It was moving. At first, it was just a dark mass, like a cloud shadow. Then the shadow resolved into shapes. Horses, riders, dozens of them. They crested the ridge, and as they did, more appeared behind them, and more, and more. They came in ranks, a silent, flowing river of men and horses, lances held high, the feathers on their tips fluttering in the high, thin wind. They did not shout, they just came. A wall of horsemen, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. A woman screamed, a high, thin sound that broke the spell. Before the scream had even faded, a new movement caught Finian's eye. To the south, from a dry arroyo that was supposed to be empty, another line of warriors emerged, fanning out, cutting off the escape route, then the east, then the west, in less than a minute. Prospect Hollow was no longer a settlement. It was a trap. The circle was complete. The town was surrounded on 4 sides by a silent, watching army. Finian squinted, his eyes stinging. He could see the dark dots of paint on the ponies, the glint of sun on metal. He saw, here and there, a lance tipped not with a stone point, but with a torch, the small flames already lit. Waiting. There were hundreds. It looked like every Apache in the territory was here. Panic, true and suffocating, seized the town. It was a wave that washed over them all. Drowning reason. Women who had been hanging laundry ran, grabbing their children, dragging them inside and bolting the flimsy doors. Men shouted, running for the rifles they kept over their fireplaces, old hunting pieces meant for deer, not for a war party. The saloon keeper and his swamper began dragging feed sacks and barrels to form a pathetic barricade in front of the bat-wing doors. The preacher stumbled into the middle of the street, his Bible held high. "The Lord is our fortress," he cried, his voice cracking. "He is our shield, let us pray." But his words were swallowed by the rising tide of sobs and curses. No one was listening. Finian stood frozen, his small body lost in the chaos. He felt a hand, hard as a block of wood, clamp down on his shoulder. He yelped and spun around. It was Malcolm Fitch. The man's face was a mask of grayish terror, his eyes wide, his thin lips pulled back from his yellowed teeth. He shook Finian, his grip biting into the boy's bone. "They're here for someone," Fitch hissed, his spittle hitting Finian's cheek. "This ain't a random raid. This is a calling out." "Who did they come for? What did you do, you little rat? What did you see?" Finian could not speak. He just stared, his mind white with fear. He had done this. The milk, the grave, the stones. He had brought this army to their door. Before he could answer, a new movement from the north silenced the entire street. One warrior detached himself from the main line on the ridge. He was mounted on a powerful black horse and carried a single, long lance decorated with eagle feathers. He rode down the slope, not at a charge, but at a steady, deliberate walk. He did not stop until he was at the edge of the settlement, just 50 yards from the cowering townsfolk. He stopped his horse, reached down, and with a single, powerful thrust, planted the butt of his lance deep in the hard, dry earth. It stood quivering, a declaration. The warrior sat tall on his horse. He wore no war paint, only a look of cold, grim authority. He waited until every eye was fixed on him. Then he spoke. His voice was deep and carried easily in the dead, terrified silence, and he spoke perfect, clear English. "We seek the boy," he called out. "We seek the one who carries the bone necklace, the one who gave milk to our warrior." He paused, his dark eyes scanning the small, terrified cluster of white faces. "He has sun-bleached hair. His eyes are the color of ash. Bring him out to us." Every sound in Prospect Hollow stopped. The crying, the praying, the cursing, all of it ceased. There was only the sound of the wind, rustling the feathers on the warrior's lance. And then, as one, every single eye in the street turned. Every man, every woman, every older child. Their heads swiveled, and their gazes locked onto the small, trembling form of Finian Ward. It was a look of pure, unadulterated accusation. It was terror, yes, but it was also something else, a cold, sudden calculation, a complete and total abandonment. They were not seeing a boy, they were seeing a sacrifice. They were seeing the single, small thing that stood between them and the 400 lances on the hills. Finian's blood turned to ice. He could not breathe. The back of his shirt was instantly soaked in cold sweat. He wanted to run, to hide, to vanish, but his feet were nailed to the ground. "The necklace?" a woman whispered, her voice rough with fear. "Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife. He means the boy, Finian." Then another voice, higher, shriller. "He's just an orphan. He's nobody. A man. One of the prospectors. Give him to them. Give him to them. And it's over. Get him," someone else shouted. But no one moved. No one stepped forward to grab him and drag him out. They were too afraid. They were terrified that any sudden move, any sign of violence against the boy, would be the signal the warriors were waiting for. They wanted him to go. They willed him to go. They waited for him to walk out on his own, to offer himself up. Finian backed away. A step, then two. He bumped into the hitching rail. He was trapped. The preacher stepped forward, his face ashen. He looked at Finian, not with accusation, but with a kind of desperate, pleading horror. He was making one last appeal, not to the town, but to his own conscience. "Finian," the preacher said, his voice trembling. "Son, do you know what they speak of? Do you know of this necklace, this milk?" His eyes begged the boy to say no, to have an explanation. "If you have a secret, Finian, you must tell it. For the love of God, all of our lives are in your hands." The weight of every eye in Prospect Hollow pressed down on Finian, heavier than the sun, colder than the grave he had dug. He looked at Fitch, who was staring at him with a look of murderous comprehension. He looked at the women, who were hiding their children's faces, as if he himself were the monster. He could not hold it in. The secret, the guilt, the fear, it all burst out of him. "I didn't," he choked, his voice a strangled sob. "I didn't do nothing wrong. Tell us," Fitch roared. "He was dying," Finian cried, the tears finally coming, hot and fast. "I found him by the creek. He was dying. He was shot, and a lion I gave him water." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. "And milk," Finian whispered, the confession tearing out of him. "I stole it from Mr. Fitch. I stole it, and I gave it to him. And when he died, I buried him. I didn't want the coyotes to get him. I buried him proper." A stunned, horrified silence fell. He had not just seen an Apache. He had helped one. He had fed one. He had honored one. Someone, a woman in the back, began to wail. "He brought the war home," she moaned. "The boy brought the war right to our door." "Treason," Fitch spat, his voice low. "He fed a savage." Finian looked at their faces, at the hatred and the terror he saw there. These were the people he had served, the people whose scraps he had eaten. And they would give him to the lances without a second thought. Then, through his fear, he thought of Tahoe. He remembered the feel of the man's hand on his chest, the final, faint pressure. He remembered the eyes, weary and grateful. Remember heart. He understood. He could run. He could try to bolt between the buildings, to hide in a cellar, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if he ran, the warriors would take it as an insult. They would see it as a white man's trick, and the town, every man, woman, and child, would be swallowed in fire and blood. His fear was immense, but his new, strange sense of honor, the honor Tahoe had pressed into his heart, was, for the first time, stronger. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. He stopped trembling. His body was still cold, but his mind was clear. He took a step. The crowd parted for him, shuffling back, as if he were carrying a plague. He walked past the preacher, whose mouth was open, forming a wordless prayer. He walked past Fitch, who looked at him with a mix of fury and relief. He stepped out onto the empty, dusty road. Alone. He put one small, bare foot in front of the other, walking toward the warrior on the black horse. The distance of 50 yards felt like 100 miles. He could feel every grain of dirt under his feet. His knees felt soft, like they might buckle, but he kept his heart straight, just as he had seen Tahoe do, even in death. He did not stop until he was standing 10 feet from the black horse, which snorted and tossed its head, its eyes rolling. The warrior on its back looked down at him. His face was like carved stone, his eyes searching, deep and hard. Finian forced himself to meet that gaze. He was terrified, but he would not look away. The warrior's gaze dropped from Finian's eyes to his chest. The bone necklace was hidden, but the warrior knew it was there. He stared at the spot on Finian's shirt for a long moment. "It is him," the warrior said, not to Finian, but to the listening hills. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, downward signal. He did not dismount. He did not speak to Finian again. He just turned his horse. Finian knew what he was supposed to do. He was to follow. He was led up the slope, away from Prospect Hollow. As he walked, the wall of warriors to his left and right parted, opening a silent corridor for him to pass through. He walked into the sea of horses and men. He felt 400 pairs of eyes on him, a physical weight, as if each one was a hand pressing on his small shoulders. They were not looking at him with hatred. It was something else, something he could not understand. It was curiosity. It was awe. It was judgment. He was 11 years old, and he was being led, alone, into the heart of an Apache army. He did not look back. The climb to Thunder Mesa was steep, and Finian's small legs ached. But the warrior on the black horse never slowed, and Finian dared not fall behind. He was pulled along in a silent tide of men and horses. The only sound, the soft thud of hooves on packed earth and the jingle of tack. Below him, Prospect Hollow shrank until it was just a collection of discarded boxes in the dust. The town, and everyone in it, already felt like a life he had lived a long time ago. When they reached the summit, the world opened up. The mesa was a vast, flat expanse of stone and dry grass, and it was covered in a sea of people. It was not a war party, not in the way Finian had imagined. This was a gathering, solemn and immense. 400 warriors, and more, including women and older children, stood in a great, silent circle, their ponies ground-hitched behind them. They were dressed in their finest, buckskins adorned with intricate beadwork, breastplates of polished bone, and headdresses of eagle and hawk feathers. They stood as still as the red rock hoodoos that dotted the mesa, a silent, bronze audience, and their collective gaze was focused on a single empty space in the center. Finian was led into this space, his bare feet silencing on the dusty ground. He felt incredibly small, a single pale speck in a vast, dark ocean. In the center of the circle, beside a small, unlit fire pit, stood two figures. The first was a man who seemed as old and solid as the mesa itself. He was tall, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle, and his face was a map of deep lines, of sun and sorrow. He wore a long, flowing headdress of eagle feathers that touched the ground behind him, and his eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow, held an authority that needed no weapon. Beside him, in stark contrast, stood the girl. It was her, the girl from the ridge, the rider of the pinto horse. She was no longer a distant silhouette. She was real, and she was terrifying. She was perhaps 14 or 15, and stood with a rigid stillness that mirrored the old man's. Her black hair was bound in two long, tight braids, and she clutched a short, powerful bow in one hand, her knuckles white. Her face was young, but it was as hard and unforgiving as flint. Her black eyes found Finian, and he saw in them a flicker of recognition, and something else, a deep, cold grief. The warrior on the black horse dismounted, spoke a few soft words in Apache to the old man, and then stepped back, melting into the circle of warriors, leaving Finian alone before the two. The old man, the chief, looked at Finian. He looked at him for a long, heavy minute, his gaze seeming to penetrate the boy's skin, to weigh the heart that beat so frantically beneath his thin shirt. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. He spoke in English, slow and deliberate, as if each word was a heavy object he was placing carefully on the ground. "I am Iron Elk," he said. "The man you found by the creek. His name was Tahoe. He was my son, my firstborn." Finian's breath hitched. He had not just fed a warrior. He had fed a chief's son. "He was a great warrior," Iron Elk continued, his gaze drifting past Finian toward the southern lands. "He guarded the valley of our ancestors. He was shot by the white man who seeks to steal that valley, a man with many cattle, who builds fences where there should be none. A man named Harlan Crowley, the name that Tahoe had whispered. Crowley. My son was shot, but he was strong. He rode for a day, trying to return to us, but the wound festered, and the lion found him." A tremor passed through the chief's massive frame, the only sign of the agony beneath the surface. "Tahoe killed the lion, but it was his last fight. He was too weak. He crawled toward the water where you found him." The chief's eyes snapped back to Finian. "For 7 days, we searched. We found the lion's body, and then one of my trackers found his grave." He paused, and the silence of the 400 warriors pressed in. "It was a strange grave," Iron Elk said. his voice softening just slightly. The tracker said the earth was packed neat and smooth. He said Tahoe's face had been wiped clean of the blood and the dirt. His eyes had been closed. His knife and his bow were placed beside him. He looked down at Finian, and the grave was ringed with round creek stones, and from the circle, a line of flat stones pointed to the west, a path to send his spirit home. The girl beside him suddenly spoke, her voice as sharp and fast as an arrow. "No Apache made that grave," she snapped, her English clear but accented. "We do not lay stones in that way. Our trackers said it was the work of a child. The prints were small." She took a step, her black eyes burning into Finian. "Another scout saw him, a small, pale-haired boy, near the creek, with a cup. It was you." Iron Elk raised a hand, and the girl fell silent, though her glare never wavered. The chief took a heavy step toward Finian, until he was close enough to cast a shadow over the boy. He knelt, a slow, creaking movement, bringing his ancient, sorrowful face level with Finian's. He did not look angry. He looked confused. He placed one enormous, calloused hand on Finian's shoulder. The weight was immense, like the mountain itself was holding him in place. "Why?" the chief asked, his voice now a low rumble. "The people in that town, they treat you like a dog. We have watched. You are thin, you are hungry, you are alone. Tahoe was the enemy of your people. He was a dying Apache. Why did you give him water? Why did you steal milk for him?" Finian trembled under the weight of the hand, the weight of the question, the weight of 400 pairs of eyes. He looked at the chief, at the deep lines of grief around his mouth, and the simple, terrible truth came out. His voice was a choked whisper, but in the absolute silence of the mesa, it carried, "Because he was all alone," Finian said, the tears he had held back in the town now welling up. No one deserves to die all alone like an animal in the dirt. I know what that feels like." He touched his own chest, where the necklace was hidden. He looked at me. He looked at me the way I always feel, like nobody needs me. The hand on his shoulder tightened, its grip becoming protective, not threatening. Iron Elk's face did not change, but his deep-set eyes seemed to register the words. The girl, Mara, let out a small, sharp breath, and her hard expression faltered, just for an instant. Iron Elk rose to his full height, pulling Finian up with him, gently but firmly. "In the way of my people," the chief said, his voice strong again, "a great debt has been created. When a man is dying, and you give him comfort, you honor his spirit. When you bury him as a warrior, you honor his tribe. When you do this for the son of a chief, you create a sacred debt. It is a debt that must be paid. It is a debt of honor, to be paid with protection, with safety sometimes, with a life." He turned his gaze from Finian to the silent circle of warriors. "My son's spirit was sent home in peace. This boy did what 400 of his own warriors could not. This debt belongs to all of us." He looked back at Finian. "But there is another debt." His voice turned cold, hard as winter iron. "There is the debt of blood. The man who shot my son, Harlan Crowley, still lives. He grows rich on our land. He builds his fences and waits for the railroad. The 400 warriors you see today, they gathered here to pay that debt. Too, we gathered for vengeance." Finian's heart hammered. He was standing in the middle of a vortex, caught between two colossal, opposing forces. "And now, child who honored my son," Iron Elk said, "you are at the center of both, so you must choose." He held up 2 fingers. "2 paths. You will choose one. Today. Now. 1, he said. You will stay with us. You will leave that town of ghosts. I will take you as my own. Tahoe is gone. I will have a new son. You will learn our ways. You will ride our horses, and you will become Apache. This will be your life, and Prospect Hollow will be nothing but a bad dream." Finian's mind reeled. "To have a father. To belong." "Or," the chief continued, his voice dropping, "you will return to them. You will stay in the white man's world, but you will keep the necklace, and with it, you will keep our promise. The debt of honor will remain. And one day, whenever you choose, you will call on us. You will send us a sign. And on that day, the 400 warriors of Thunder Mesa will come again, and we will do whatever you ask of us. If you need protection, we will be your shield. If you seek vengeance, we will be your spear." Finian stared, his 11-year-old mind trying to grasp the enormity of the choice. To leave everything he had ever known, as miserable as it was, and vanish into the wilderness, or to return to Fitch, to the hunger, to the loneliness, but carrying a secret weapon, the power to call down an army. He was just a boy. He did not know how to choose a whole life. He looked at the hard, implacable faces of the warriors. He looked at Mara, who was watching him with a new, strange, calculating intensity. He looked at Iron Elk, who waited, his face patient as stone. Finian could not speak. He just shook his head, overwhelmed. Iron Elk watched him, his gaze softening. He saw the child, the terror and confusion. He let out a long breath. "No, you are too young to see the whole path. A choice this big cannot be made in fear." The chief reached out and gently pulled the bone necklace from under Finian's shirt, letting it hang in the open. "Then we will do this," he said. "Today, we answer the debt of honor. We will not harm your town. We will not harm you. We will let you go." He tucked the necklace back under the boy's shirt. "But the second debt, the promise remains. You will carry it." He tapped Finian's chest. "Today, we are even, but tomorrow is new. One day, you will be a man, and you will understand, and you will be the one to choose which debt is called." The tension on the mesa seemed to break. The warriors did not move, but the air felt lighter. Mara stepped forward. She looked at Iron Elk, then at Finian. She reached out, her movements quick and precise, and retied the leather thong of the necklace, which Finian had tied in a clumsy knot. Her fingers were cool and sure, but they fumbled for a moment. One long, slender finger brushed against the skin of Finian's neck. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it shot through Finian like a spark, a tiny jolt of warmth and something else, something he had no name for. It was the first human touch he had felt in as long as he could remember that was not a shove or a blow. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her hard composure returning instantly. She looked at him, one last, long, unreadable look, and then stepped back to her father's side, her hand gripping her bow. It was a moment that lasted no more than a second, but Finian knew he would remember it for the rest of his life, that brief, accidental touch, and the dark, deep eyes of the girl who had lost a brother and found something else. Time is a river that flows differently in the high desert. It can stand still for a decade, then wash a life away in a single afternoon. For Finian Ward, it moved like a slow, steady current, pulling him away from the shore of his childhood. He stayed in Prospect Hollow for 4 more years after the day the warriors came. The town never forgot. They never forgave him. Not for bringing the Apache army, but for being the one they were willing to sacrifice. He was no longer just the orphan. He was a living reminder of their own cowardice, and they hated him for it. Fitch's commands grew sharper, the scraps of food smaller, but no one, not even Fitch, dared to lay a hand on him. They were terrified that the boy, who had walked out to meet an army and returned unharmed, held some dark medicine. The day he turned 15, Finian walked into the stable, took a bridle, a blanket, and the best horse Fitch owned, and rode west. He did not look back. He left the town that had never wanted him, carrying his only possession, the bone necklace, hidden under his shirt, its edges worn smooth from years of his own sweat and touch. The world was a hard teacher. He drifted. He learned to read brands, to mend fences, to live in a saddle for weeks at a time. He learned that a quiet mouth and a fast hand were the only currency that mattered. He grew tall, his body hardening from a boy's thin frame into a man's lean muscle. The sun-bleached hair turned the color of old straw, and the ash-gray eyes became watchful, missing nothing. He learned how to use the Colt revolver he bought with his first real pay, and he learned to use it well enough that men stopped trying to test him. He became a cowboy, a drifter, and when the pay was right, a hired gun, guarding cattle drives and payrolls. By the time he was 23, Finian Ward had a reputation. He was known as Finn, a quiet, reliable man who finished a job. And he had found work, good work, with the biggest outfit in the territory. He rode for Harlan Crowley. The name, whispered by a dying Tahoe all those years ago, had eventually found him. Crowley's sprawling HC ranch was based near the new, booming railroad town of Mesa Crossing, 100 miles south of the forgotten speck of Prospect Hollow. Crowley was everything Tahoe had said, and more. He was not a man. He was an empire of barbed wire and beef. He owned the bank in Mesa Crossing. He had the sheriff on his payroll, and his cattle grazed on 1 million acres of land, much of it secured from Apache and smaller homesteaders who had been mysteriously burned out or scared off. Crowley was a new kind of Western power. He was a businessman. He did not, as a rule, harm women or children. He did not need to. He simply destroyed the men who stood in his way, using the law when he could, and hired guns when he could not. He pushed men into dangerous situations, bankrupted them with legal fees, and bought their land at auction for pennies on the dollar. And he fueled the simmering hatred for the Apache, using every minor incident as an excuse to call for military protection for the lands he had, in fact, stolen. Finn, with his skill on a horse and the cold efficiency of his gun, had become one of Crowley's most trusted hands. He was a top man, a foreman on the trail, and every single day, he lived with the acid knowledge that he was taking blood money from the man who had murdered Tahoe. The bone necklace felt heavier with every paycheck he cashed. He was torn in two, a man living a lie, working for his enemy, telling himself he was just surviving, just biding his time, saving his money for a place of his own, far away from all of it. The reckoning came on a hot, still afternoon in the Eagle Beak Valley. It was a long, narrow cut of land, sacred to the Apache, but Crowley wanted it. It held the only year-round water for 50 miles, and he was pushing 3,000 head of cattle through it, a deliberate act of possession. Finn was riding point, his eyes scanning the high rock walls that shimmered in the heat. He hated this. The air felt wrong, thick with a watching silence. The same silence he remembered from the hills above Ashwind Creek. The cowhands were jumpy, their rifles out of their scabbards, their jokes loud and nervous. "Damn rocks feel like they got eyes," the man next to him, a kid named Billy, muttered, wiping sweat from his face. "Just keep the herd moving," Finn said, his voice flat. And then, they were there. They did not ride in, they simply appeared, as if the rocks themselves had given birth to them. On the high cliffs, on the valley floor, a party of 20 Apache warriors sat on their ponies, blocking the trail. They were not painted for war, but they were armed with rifles, lances, and a cold, unmoving stillness. The cattle drive halted, the long column of steers bunching up, their lowing echoing off the canyon walls. Crowley, riding a big bay gelding, pushed his way to the front, his face red with anger. "What in the hell is this?" he boomed. "Finn, tell these savages to get out of our way?" Finn's hand instinctively went to his chest, to the open collar of his shirt, to tuck the necklace out of sight. It was a reflex he had done 1,000 times, but it was too late. The leader of the Apache group kneed their pony forward. It was a pinto, a splash of white and brown, the same pinto from all those years ago. The rider was no longer a girl. She was a woman. It was Mara. She had grown into her power. The roundness of her face had given way to the high, strong cheekbones of her people. Her black hair was still in 2 long braids, but they were now wrapped in otter skin and tipped with the feathers of a red-tailed hawk. She wore a buckskin tunic, and a rifle was cradled in her arms. But it was her eyes that held him, the same dark, burning eyes. But the girlish confusion was gone, replaced by a sharp, intelligent, and dangerous authority. She was a warrior. Her gaze swept over the cowhands, over Crowley, and then it found Finn. He saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her eyes widened, just for a second, Her gaze dropped from his face to his hand. The hand still clutching the front of his shirt, and she saw it, the dark leather thong, the glint of carved bone peeking out. Her face, which had been a mask of cold command, flashed with a complex storm of emotions. Disbelief, confusion, and then a deep, sudden, and bitter understanding. She recognized the boy who had honored her brother, and she saw, in that same instant, that he was now a man riding for the man who had murdered him. In that single silent beat, 12 years collapsed. For Finn, the world dissolved. He was not a 23-year-old foreman. He was an 11-year-old boy, standing on the mesa, feeling the impossible weight of a chief's hand on his shoulder, feeling the jolt of her finger on his neck. For Mara, the image was just as sharp, the perfectly tended grave in the moonlight, the small, pale boy by the creek, the empty tin cup, and now, that same boy, grown, wearing the uniform of the enemy, protecting the herd of the man who had stolen their land and their blood. The standoff was taut as a bowstring. "I said, tell them to move!" Crowley shouted, his hand dropping to the holster on his hip. "That's a bad idea, boss," Finn said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving Mara. "The hell it is!" Another cowboy snarled, raising his rifle. "Let's clean 'em out." "Stand down," Finn commanded, his own voice cracking with an authority that surprised him. He turned his horse, placing himself between Crowley and Mara. "Don't shoot. Just let me talk." He raised his hand, palm out, the universal sign. He spoke in the few, broken Apache words he had forced himself to learn over the years. Words picked up in saloons and from trackers. "We no want fight," he said, his voice rough. "We pass, only pass." Mara stared at him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. She did not lower her rifle. Behind her, another figure emerged from the rocks, an older man, his long hair gray, his body still powerful but bent with age. It was Iron Elk, his eyes, still deep and sharp, found Finn. He saw the necklace, now worn openly. He saw the HC brand on Finn's horse. He saw the man his son's savior had become. His face was a mask of profound, weary sorrow. He looked at Crowley, his gaze turning to Flint. He spoke, and Mara translated, her voice flat and cold, all emotion gone. "Iron Elk says this is our valley. It is not for your cattle. He says you are Harlan Crowley. You are a thief. You are the man who shot his son." Crowley's face went purple. "I don't know what the hell he's talking about. This is railroad land. Bought and paid for, now get out of my way, or we'll move you." Several of the cowboys cocked their rifles, the sound echoing in the narrow canyon. The Apache warriors raised their own. "No!" Finn shouted. He looked at Iron Elk. "Chief, please, there are too many. Too much blood. Let the cattle pass. This one time, no one gets hurt. This one time." Iron Elk stared at Finn for a long time. He looked at the 3,000 steers, a wave of destruction. He looked at the 30 armed cowhands. He looked at the 20 warriors. He knew a fight here would be a massacre. For both sides. He spoke softly to Mara. "My father, he agrees." Mara translated, her voice tight with anger at the decision. "He does not wish to spill blood for cows. He will let you pass. This one time." She locked her eyes on Crowley. "But he says this, Harlan Crowley, the next time you set foot in this valley, you will pay the price for all of it, for the land, and for Tahoe." Iron Elk raised his hand. His warriors, like shadows, melted back into the rocks, clearing the path. Crowley laughed, a short, ugly bark. Yeah, you tell the old man he can send me the bill." He spurred his horse. "Move 'em out, boys!" The cattle drive lurched forward, a river of dust and horns. Finn stayed where he was, his horse breathing hard, until the last of the herd had passed. He was the last man, the drag rider. As he turned to follow, Mara kneed her pinto, blocking his path for a second. She rode close, so close their legs almost touched. He could smell the sage and smoke on her clothes. He could see the anger and the deep, aching hurt in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered in English, her voice fluent and clear, honed by years of listening to the white men she despised. "We still remember the milk," she hissed. her voice low and shaking with fury. "And we still remember my brother." She looked at the necklace on his chest with contempt. "And we will remember the man who wears his bones and rides for his killer." She spun the pinto on its haunches and was gone, galloping up the rockfall, disappearing into the sun. Finn sat his horse, the dust of the cattle drive settling on him, the dust of her words settling in him. He felt as if he had been shot. He was trapped, caught, a man of two worlds and a traitor to both. That night, he sat by the campfire, apart from the others, the bone necklace a heavy, burning weight in his hand. The other cowhands were passing a bottle, their voices loud, their laughter harsh and ugly. "Did you see the look on that old chief's face?" One of them laughed. "Crowley stared him down proper. Should have just cleaned him out," Billy, the kid, said, his voice full of whiskey bravery. "Cleaned out the whole nest of 'em. That's what I say. One good sweep." Finn closed his eyes. Their laughter grated on his nerves. And then he heard it. Faint. So faint it was almost just a pulse in the ground. From the direction of the valley, bum, 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 bum. A drum, a single Apache drum, beating a slow, steady, patient rhythm in the darkness. He clutched the necklace. Iron Elk's promise, 12 years old, rose in his mind. "One day, you will call on us and 400 warriors will come." He had always imagined that day would be simple, that he would call them to save him, or to destroy an enemy. He had never, in all his years, imagined that the enemy would be his own boss. He had never imagined that the price of that promise might be the contempt in Mara's eyes. Mara's parting words in the valley were a brand on Finn's soul. "We will remember the man who wears his bones and rides for his killer." The contempt in her eyes haunted his sleep, a poison more potent than whiskey. He could not erase the shame, and he could not quit. To ride for Crowley was to have a full belly, a good horse, and a place in the white world. To leave was to become a drifter again, or worse, to admit his own hypocrisy. But he could not stay away. His work as a foreman often took him to the edges of Crowley's vast, stolen territory, checking fence lines or tracking stray cattle, and time and again, he found his horse wandering, as if of its own accord, north, back toward the Eagle Beak Valley, back toward the high, quiet hills, back toward Ashwin Creek. It was the place where it had all begun. 12 years before, the creek itself was miles from Crowley's ranch, but it felt like the center of Finn's world, the axle on which his two lives turned. He would ride out, telling the other hands he was checking for Apache signs, a bitter irony that tasted like ash in his mouth, and he would sit by the water, the place where he had found Tahoe. He would wait, his heart a dull, heavy ache, hoping to catch a glimpse of a pinto horse, of long black braids. For weeks, he saw nothing. The hills were silent, watching him with an emptiness that felt like judgment. Then, one afternoon, as the sun began to dip, he saw her. She was not on the ridge. She was on the other side of the creek, not 20 yards away. She was standing, not hiding, her pinto pony grazing peacefully behind her. Her bow was on her shoulder, and one hand rested, seemingly casually, on the hilt of the knife at her belt. She had been watching him arrive. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the creek gurgling between them. "You're a long way from your herd," she said. Her voice was clear, carrying easily over the water. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Just checking the water," Finn said. His voice was rough. He felt like a boy again, caught stealing milk. "This is not your water." "No," he agreed, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It's yours." He dismounted, letting his horse's reins trail. He sat on a rock, his back to her, but he knew she was still watching. I don't ride for him because I want to." "You ride for his coin," she said, her voice sharp. "You guard his stolen cattle. It is the same thing. You dishonor the necklace you wear." Finn's hand closed around the bones under his shirt. "I dishonor it every day. I know that, but it's the only thing I have." He turned to face her, his eyes pleading for an understanding he did not deserve. "I was an orphan. I was starving. Your father, gave me a choice I was too young to make. I went back. In that town, they hated me. I left. I took the only work I could find. Crowley's was the only outfit paying. What else was I supposed to do? Die, perhaps, Mara said, her voice cold. My brother did. The words struck him silent. He had no answer for that. He just sat, letting her anger wash over him. He stayed until the sun touched the ridge. When he looked up, she was gone. But he came back 3 days later, and she was there again. They talked, their words awkward and wary, tossed across the small, rushing stream. It became their ritual. He told her about his life in Prospect Hollow, about Fitch, about the years of drifting, about the cold loneliness of the bunkhouses. He told her of the shame he felt, of being trapped in a life he despised. She, in turn, told him of her people. She spoke of the hard winters, of the hunger when the soldiers pushed them onto the dry reservations. She spoke of the buffalo being slaughtered by the white hunters, of the sacred grass in the valley being chewed to mud by Crowley's thousands of longhorns. She spoke of Tahoe, not as a warrior, but as a brother, one who had taught her to track, who had laughed when she fell from her pony. The barrier between them, the creek, began to feel less like a border and more like a meeting place. They moved from accusation to a shared, weary understanding. They were both trapped, he by his choices, she by the invasion of her world. One afternoon, he brought an apple, polished and red, from the mess wagon. He set it on a flat rock at the water's edge. He backed away. She watched him, then slowly crossed the creek, her movements graceful, picked it up, and bit into it. The next week, she left a piece of dried, smoked venison on the same rock. They began to smile. He told her a clumsy joke he'd heard in the saloon, and to his astonishment, she laughed. A short, clear sound that startled a bird from a nearby tree. He taught her the English words for stubborn and beautiful, and she taught him the Apache words for enemy and friend. He learned they were, in her language, dangerously close. The line between them was blurring. One hot, muggy afternoon, the sky the color of a fresh bruise, he found her hunting. She was tracking a rabbit, moving along the slick, mossy stones by the creek's edge. He was about to call out when her foot slipped. She went down hard, her arm scraping against a jagged edge of granite. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath. Finn was moving before he thought. He was across the creek in 3 bounds, water splashing to his knees. He found her sitting up, her face pale, her teeth gritted. A long, deep gash ran from her elbow to her wrist, the blood welling up dark and fast. "Don't!" she hissed, trying to pull away as he knelt beside her, but he ignored her. "Hold still," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "That's a bad one. It needs to be wrapped." He ripped the kerchief from his own neck, a faded blue piece of cotton. His hands were sure, his years of ranch work and self-care making the movements automatic. He folded it into a thick pad and pressed it firmly against the cut. She winced, but his other hand was on her shoulder, holding her steady. He was close, closer than they had ever been. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his soap, mixed with leather and horse and the wood smoke that clung to his clothes. His head was bent low, his sun-bleached hair falling forward as he concentrated, his brow furrowed. He tied the ends of the kerchief, his fingers brushing against the soft skin of her inner arm. The touch was practical, necessary, but it sent a jolt through both of them. His hands were warm and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. The gap between their 2 worlds, the distance of history and blood and betrayal, suddenly shrank. It was no longer the 1,000 miles of prairie. It was just the few inches of air between his chest and her shoulder. She could feel his breath, steady and warm, on her cheek. She could feel the solid, reassuring strength in his hands. "There," he said, his voice low. "That should hold it until you can get it cleaned." He looked up, and his gray eyes met her dark ones. He was so close. He had not realized how close. He could see the small flecks of gold in her irises, the slight tremor of her lips. The air between them was thick, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. He let go of her arm, but he did not move away, nor did she. They just knelt, facing each other, for a long, silent moment. The world reduced to the sound of the creek and the pounding of their own blood. He finally stood, clearing his throat, and offered her a hand. "Can you stand?" She ignored his hand and rose to her feet in one fluid motion, her pride returning. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little breathless. She looked at the blue kerchief on her arm, a white man's color, his color. "I thank you." "Be careful on the rocks," he said. She nodded, turned, and disappeared into the trees without a backward glance. But the spell had been cast. The touch had been made. A week later, the bruised sky finally broke. It was a full-blown plains thunderstorm. The day started hot and suffocating, and by evening, the heavens opened. Rain did not fall. It hammered. A solid, driving sheet of water that turned the dry arroyos into raging, muddy rivers in minutes. Thunder cannoned off the mesas, a sound so loud it shook the ground. Finn was at the ranch, but he was not thinking of the cattle. He was thinking of Mara. He had promised to meet her. He knew she would not be there. It was madness to go out. But he also knew he had to. He saddled his horse, ignoring the shouts of the other hands. Who thought he was insane? "Lost a steer," he yelled over the roar of the wind, and rode out, bending low against the deluge. He rode into the heart of the storm, his horse struggling through mud and over rocks. The world was a gray, roaring chaos, lit by blinding, jagged flashes of lightning. He reached Ashwind Creek, now a brown, churning torrent, and he despaired. She would not be here. He was about to turn back when a flicker of lightning illuminated the far bank. He saw her pinto, huddled under a thick stand of pines, and then he saw her. She was not at their usual spot, but further down, pressed into a shallow overhang, a hollow in the rock face that offered a small, cramped pocket of shelter. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, a single blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had come. He forced his horse through the rising water, the current nearly taking them both, and scrambled up the bank, pulling the horse after him. He ran to the overhang and crowded in beside her, dragging his sodden blanket with him. "You're crazy," he shouted over the storm. "So are you," she shouted back, her eyes wide, but a small smile playing on her lips. The space was tiny, a natural stone alcove barely big enough for one, let alone two. To stay out of the driving rain, they had to press together, their backs against the cold rock, their shoulders, hips and legs pressed tight. The wind howled, and the rain fell in a solid curtain just inches from their faces. They were a tiny, warm island in a cold, violent ocean. The shared danger, the forced intimacy, stripped away the last of their defenses. They were just two people, cold and wet and hiding from the storm. He could feel her shivering, and he put his arm around her, pulling her closer. She resisted for a moment, then leaned into his warmth, her head finding the natural hollow of his shoulder. He could feel the rapid, steady beat of her heart, or perhaps it was his own. He could not tell where one of them ended and the other began. He draped his own wet blanket over their shoulders, adding its small warmth to hers. "Better," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "A little," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the storm, listening to the thunder crack and roll. The rain became a steady, drumming roar, a wall of sound that shut out the rest of the world. There was no Crowley, no Apache tribe, no past, no future. There was only the shelter, and the warmth, and the rain. "I'm afraid," she said, her voice so low he barely heard it. "Of the storm." "No, of my father, of what is coming. He is old, Finn, and the young warriors, they are angry. They want the vengeance he promised. They want to pay the blood debt. I'm afraid I will lose them all. I'm afraid of what we are becoming." He tightened his grip on her shoulder. "I'm ashamed," he whispered back. the confession torn from him in the dark. "I'm ashamed. Every day. I see Tahoe's face every time Crowley gives me an order. I hear your voice every time I cash his pay. I'm a coward. Mara, I'm just a coward who's afraid of being alone again." She turned her head, her face just inches from his. In the dim, gray light, he could see the rain clinging to her eyelashes. "You are not a coward," she said, her voice fierce. "The boy who stole milk for my brother was not a coward." She raised a hand, her fingers cool from the rain, and touched the side of his face. She traced the line of his jaw. Then her thumb brushed a small, white scar on his chin. "What is this?" He gave a short, rough laugh. "Fell off a horse when I was 16. I was trying to show off for a girl in Mesa Crossing. Landed on my face." Her thumb rested on the scar, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "You were always foolish." Her fingers, as if with a mind of their own, slid from his chin, down his throat, to the wet cloth of his shirt. They found the hard, familiar shape beneath it. She grasped the bone necklace. "The mark of my brother," she whispered. The rain, the wind, the entire world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, his arm around her hand on his chest, holding the link that bound them. He looked at her strong, beautiful, rain-streaked face. He saw the sorrow in her eyes, and the strength, and something else, something that mirrored the ache in his own chest. He did not think. He just acted. He leaned in, and his other hand came up, cupping her face, his thumb gently brushing the water from her cheek. He tilted her chin up. A brilliant flash of lightning lit the world, and in that stark, white moment, he saw her eyes close. He pressed his lips to hers. The first kiss was slow, hesitant, a question asked in the dark. It was the taste of rain and salt and a deep, shared loneliness. She was still a bird held in the hand, and then her own hand, the one not holding the necklace, came up and tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming as fierce and undeniable as the storm raging around them. It was a release, a flood of all the things they could not say, of all the years of pain and confusion and longing. It was not gentle. It was a claiming. It was a drowning. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The thunder rolled, a low growl of approval. He held her tighter, his face buried in her wet hair, breathing in the scent of her, of sage and pine and damp earth. "Mara," he whispered, just saying her name. She said nothing, just held him, her hand gripping the back of his shirt. They sank down, huddling together against the cold rock wall, wrapped in their two sodden blankets. He kissed her again, more softly this time, and then her forehead, her eyelids, her cheek. His hands traced the shape of her shoulders, her back, learning her as if by touch in the dark. She returned the embrace, her arms circling his waist, holding him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was washing away. They lay curled together, a tangle of limbs and wet blankets, listening to the rain slow to a steady drum. They did not speak of love. They did not speak of the future. They did not need to. For this one night, in the heart of the storm, they were not a white man and an Apache. They were just Finn and Mara. As the first gray hint of dawn touched the sky, they lay with their foreheads touching, their breathing in sync. "Whatever happens," he whispered, his promise sealed in the storm, "I will be on your side, always." She just held his hand, and he knew it was enough. The night in the rock shelter changed everything. The boundary of skin and breath had been crossed, and the secret they shared was no longer just about a shared past, but a shared, impossible future. Finn returned to Crowley's ranch a different man, his senses sharper, his shame replaced by a cold, simmering anger. The love he felt for Mara was not a soft thing. It was a whetstone, sharpening his hatred for the man he worked for. He began to watch Harlan Crowley, not as a foreman, but as a spy. While Finn and Mara continued their secret meetings by the creek, their conversations now urgent and whispered, Crowley was moving. The railroad was pushing west, and Crowley intended to own every spring, every valley, and every grazing pasture the tracks would touch. He wanted it all, and the Apache, with their ancestral claims and their stubborn refusal to vanish, were the last obstacle. One night, Finn was at the ranch headquarters, going over the weekly tallies with Crowley. The boss was in a fine mood, expansive, pouring expensive whiskey. "We're on the verge of greatness." "Finn," Crowley said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "This whole territory, clean and clear, ready for the future. Just one last bit of spring cleaning." He was expecting a telegram. Finn, dismissed, lingered in the dark hallway outside the pool of light from Crowley's office, pretending to check a chart on the wall. He heard the clatter of the telegraph key from the next room, then footsteps. A different man entered the office. Not a cowboy, but a stranger in a city suit. Finn did not recognize him. He pressed himself into the shadows of the hall, his ear close to the thin plank wall. "They're hired," the stranger's voice said, low and smooth. 12 of them. Good men, hard cases from up Kansas way. They'll be here by the end of the week." "Excellent," Crowley's voice rumbled. "And the supplies? All arranged. We'll get them the buckskins, the paint, even a few old lances we bought off a trader. When they're done, they'll look like the real thing. A proper war party." Finn's blood went cold. "Here's the plan," Crowley continued, his voice dropping. "The train on the new spur line, the one carrying the Army payroll, it passes the Red Canyon cut on Friday. Your war party hits it hard. They take the cash, of course, but that's not the point. The point is the message. They leave a few lances, a few bodies. Make it look savage." "And after?" the stranger asked. "Then they ride east, toward the Miller homestead. Small place, neutral. No one will suspect I'm involved. They burn the barn, run off the stock, make a lot of smoke. By the time the survivors get to Mesa Crossing screaming about an Apache massacre, my telegrams to the governor and the fort will already be sent. It's a full-on uprising. The Army will have no choice but to move in. And I'll give them a guide straight to Iron Elk's stronghold." Finn felt sick. He was listening to the blueprint for the extermination of Mara's people. He stayed frozen in the shadows, his mind reeling. Crowley and the stranger continued to talk, their voices a low drone of logistics, of money changing hands. When the stranger left, Finn waited, his heart pounding a hole in his chest. He had to be sure. He needed more. He waited an hour, until the light in Crowley's office went out and he heard the heavy tread of his boss heading to the main house. He slipped into the office. It smelled of cigar smoke and whiskey. He lit a match. On the desk, unrolled, was a map of the territory. The Red Canyon cut was circled in red. A second circle, further east, was drawn around the Miller homestead. It was all just as he'd heard. His eyes scanned the cluttered office. In the corner, unlocked, was a fine wooden gun case. It held Crowley's prized collection. Finn lifted the lid. Inside, on red velvet, lay a half-dozen pistols and rifles, and there, gleaming, was a brand-new Sharps Borchardt model rifle, a heavy, powerful, long-range weapon. It was an expensive, specialized gun, and beside it sat an identical, older model. This one was worn, the stock scarred, the barrel pitted. It was the exact same unusual make. Finn felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered Tahoe's whisper, "Shot." He remembered the small, round, perfectly clean hole on Tahoe's shoulder, a wound that was not from a common revolver or a Winchester. It was the work of a high-velocity, military-grade rifle, a rifle just like this one. Crowley had not just ordered a murder. He had, all those years ago, likely pulled the trigger himself. This was not business. This was personal. This was the bad white man Tahoe had named with his dying breath. The match burned his fingers, and he dropped it, plunging the room into darkness. He stood there, his soul torn in two. He was a paid man, a foreman. To betray his boss was the one unforgivable sin in the cowboy code. But to stay silent was to betray Tahoe's memory, to betray the bone necklace, to betray Mara. He made his choice. He rode out before dawn, a hard, desperate ride. Pushing his horse until its flanks were dark with sweat, he found Mara at Ashwind Creek. In the gray, pre-dawn light, she was waiting for him. She saw the look on his face and the hard-set line of his jaw, and her hand went to her knife. "Finn, what is it?" He stumbled from his horse and pulled her into the cover of the junipers, his hands gripping her arms. "He's going to kill them all," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "Crowley, he's planned it all." He told her everything, the strangers, the fake Apache, the plan to rob the train, the plan to burn the Miller homestead. He told her about the rifle in the case, the one that matched Tahoe's wound. He watched her face as he spoke. The love and warmth he had seen in her eyes during the storm was snuffed out, replaced by something cold and terrible. It was a cold, pure, righteous fury that mirrored his own. The grief for her brother, which had softened over time, now crystallized into a diamond-hard point of hatred. "He will blame us," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "He will use my brother's murder to murder my family. He will make us the savages in his story." "They strike on Friday," Finn said. "The train, then the homestead. We have to stop them." "Stop them!" Mara's voice was lethal. "We will kill them. I will take this to my father. The warriors who wanted blood will have it. We will burn Crowley's ranch to the ground before the sun sets." "No." Finn gripped her tighter. "Mara, listen to me. If you attack now, you do exactly what he wants. You prove him right. The army will come. You'll be fighting soldiers, not just hired guns. You can't win that way." "We will die fighting then?" she said, pulling away from him. "There's another way," he said, his mind racing. "A better way. We don't just stop him. We expose him." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What way?" "First, we have to stop the attack on the homestead. The Miller family, they're innocent. They're just part of his plan." "And the train. The train, the money, that's his business," Finn said. The plan forming, cold and hard. "Let his thieves rob him. Let them become outlaws, but they will not burn a family. They will not kill children to start a war." Mara took the news to Thunder Mesa, just as she'd predicted. The war council was a storm of voices. The younger warriors, led by a fierce brave named Cale, demanded an immediate strike. They wanted to ride on Crowley's ranch, to take his scalp and burn his empire to the ground. A direct, bloody answer for Tahoe. But Iron Elk, older and wiser, listened to Mara. He saw the trap. He knew that an attack would bring the soldiers and the end of his people. "We will wait," he commanded, his voice quieting the council. "We will let the white man show his true face." The debate raged for 2 days, and in that time, Crowley's plan, now in motion, went wrong for him, and right for Finn. The train robbery was a disaster. The fake Apache were hard cases, but they were not warriors. They were clumsy. They managed to stop the train, but the army guards put up a furious fight. 2 of the hired guns were killed, and they fled with only a fraction of the payroll, leaving their dead and one of their fake buckskin and feather costumes behind. The army now had proof, not of an Apache raid, but of white outlaws in disguise. Crowley, furious that his plan had been botched, ordered the second phase to proceed immediately. The surviving 10 riders, desperate and angry, rode east. Finn, his gut churning, had been watching the smoke. He knew the Miller homestead. He rode there, not as a foreman, but as a savior, pushing his horse faster than he ever had in his life. He was too late to stop the attack, but not too late to stop the massacre. He crested the ridge and saw the homestead below. The barn was already a pillar of black smoke and bright orange flame. The 10 riders were scattering the cattle, firing their guns into the air, whooping and yelling. He saw Mrs. Miller dragging her elderly father toward the root cellar. "The children!" she shrieked, seeing Finn. They were in the barn, in the loft. Finn didn't hesitate. He launched himself from his horse, his revolver in his hand. He fired 2 shots over the heads of the raiders, who, seeing a single determined rider, and already spooked from the train robbery, scattered and fled. their job of making smoke complete. Finn ran toward the burning barn. The roar of the fire was deafening, the heat so intense it seared his lungs. "Ben Sarah," he roared. He heard a terrified wail from inside. He wrapped his kerchief over his mouth and plunged into the inferno. The smoke was a solid, blinding wall. Hay was raining down in fiery clumps. Above him, he heard the children crying. He scrambled up the loft ladder, the rungs hot to the touch. He found them, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, huddled in the corner, paralyzed with terror. "Come on," he yelled, grabbing them both. He slung the girl over his shoulder and pulled the boy by the arm. A beam, trailing fire, crashed down where they had been hiding. He half fell, half jumped down the ladder, shielding them with his own body as he rolled onto the dirt floor. He ran out into the clean, open air, his lungs burning, his clothes smoldering, and did not stop until he had placed both coughing, soot-covered children into their mother's arms. He stood, panting, watching the barn collapse into a mountain of fire. The news hit Mesa Crossing like a thunderclap. Apache attack. The telegraph key clicked, and Crowley, in his office, smiled, his plan finally coming to fruition. He did not know his raiders had been routed, or that the army was already examining the body of a white outlaw in a cheap costume. He only knew he had his uprising. Finn rode back to the ranch, the smell of smoke on his clothes, the feeling of the children's small, terrified bodies in his arms. He looked at his hands, blackened with soot. He had saved them. He had done one good thing, but the fire had been set. He passed the bunkhouse, where the other hands were oiling their rifles, excited, ready for a war, and he knew his promise to Mara, "I will be on your side," was not enough. Mara met him that night, not at the creek, but in the dark shadows of the canyon. She had seen the smoke. She had seen the Miller family, homeless, riding to town, their faces pale with terror. Her heart, which had been so hard with hatred for Crowley, now ached with a different kind of pain. She ached for the innocent. She saw that the fire Crowley had lit was meant to burn everyone, white and Apache alike. He was using all of them. "This is his war," she said, her voice quiet, shaking. "He will not make it ours." Finn nodded, his face grim in the moonlight. "He has to be stopped, not just his plan, him, and it can't be you, it can't be your warriors. If you ride in, you'll be the savages he's been waiting for." He looked up at the dark shape of Thunder Mesa, rising against the stars. "It has to be me, and it has to be now." He rode, alone, all night. He did not go to Ashwind Creek. He rode straight to the stronghold on Thunder Mesa. He was not a boy this time. He was a man, coming to make good on a promise. He stood before Iron Elk, who was surrounded by his war council, the air thick with tension. Finn did not wait to be questioned. He reached up, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he unfastened the leather thong. He pulled the bone necklace from around his neck, the first time it had been off in 12 years. The skin beneath it felt cold and bare. He stepped forward and placed the necklace in Iron Elk's outstretched hand. "Chief Iron Elk," he said, his voice ringing with a clear, cold authority he did not know he possessed. "The debt is still owed. I have come to call it." The council was silent. Kale, the young, hot-blooded warrior, stepped forward, his eyes gleaming. "Good," he said. "We ride. We will burn Crowley's house around his ears." "No," Finn said, turning to him. He looked back at Iron Elk. "I do not ask for a massacre. I do not ask you to become the men he pretends you are." He laid his hand on the map he had brought, the one from Crowley's office, showing the circles around the train and the homestead. "I ask for justice," Finn said. "I want the 400 warriors to ride, but not to attack, to surround, to hold. I want you to VERYPRECICLY surround his ranch. Let no one in and no one out. And then I want you, and the people from Mesa Crossing, and the army men who found the fake bodies, all to be there. I will bring Crowley out, and I will make him confess, in front of both our peoples, what he did. I want to pull his lies out by the root, in the light of the sun, for all to see. I want justice for Tahoe. And I want justice for the Miller family." Iron Elk looked at the necklace in his palm. He looked at the hard, determined face of the man who had once been a boy. He closed his hand around the bones. "You have chosen well," the chief said. "You have asked not for vengeance, but for truth." He raised his head, his old eyes burning. "The debt will be paid." The ride back from Thunder Mesa was a blur. Finn rode not as a foreman, but as the tip of a spear, leaving the full weight of the 400 warriors to move behind him. A silent, gathering storm. He left the ranch in darkness, a traitor in the eyes of his boss. He would return at dawn, a judge, as the first thin, gray light of morning touched the eastern sky. Harlan Crowley's ranch was not waking to the sound of a cook's triangle, but to a new, terrible silence. A ranch hand, stumbling from the bunkhouse, was the first to see it. He stopped, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. On the low ridge to the north, where there should have been only cactus and rock, there was a line of horsemen. They were motionless, dark silhouettes against the graying sky. He turned, and his cup smashed on the ground. To the south, on the rise above the creek, stood another line. To the east, blocking the main road to Mesa Crossing. Another. To the west, sealing the canyon. Another. 400 warriors. They sat on their ponies, lances held upright, a forest of wood and steel and feathers, ringing the entire ranch. It was Prospect Hollow all over again. A perfect, inescapable circle. But this time, the circle was not around a town of the innocent. It was around the fortress of the guilty. The ranch exploded into panicked chaos. Men, half-dressed, ran from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand. Apache, my God, it's a war party. Harlan Crowley burst from his main house, his suspenders hanging by his knees, a shotgun in his hands. He looked north, his face ashen. He looked south, his face turning a dark, mottled red of pure fury. "They're here," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "It's the uprising. It's just like I told the army. Get to the walls, shoot any that move you. Billy, saddle the bay, ride like hell for the fort. Tell them we're under attack." Billy, the young hand, his face white, ran for the stables. Crowley's other men, some 25 hired guns, fumbled with cartridge belts and took up positions behind the ranch's low adobe wall, their rifles trembling. Billy burst from the stable, flogging the fast bay horse, and charged for the east road. He got less than 50 yards before 3 tall warriors rode out from their line to block his path. They did not raise their rifles. They just sat, their lances lowered. Billy reined his horse in so hard it reared, screaming. He turned, galloping for the south exit. He was met by 3 more. He tried the west. He was met again. Every road, every path, every dry wash and rabbit run was sealed. The trap was absolute. Billy galloped back to the main yard, his face a mask of terror, and threw himself from the saddle. "They're not attacking, boss," he gasped, wild-eyed. "They're just sitting there. They're everywhere. We can't get out." "Then we'd fight 'em here," Crowley roared, his panic turning to bluster. He chambered a shell. "This is what they wanted. This is what they'll get." He did not see the 2 figures slip through the back gate of the stables, the one that led to the corrals, in the sudden chaotic noise of men shouting and horses rearing. No one heard Finn and Mara enter the long, dark stable. The air was thick with the smell of hay and fear. Finn walked out into the main aisle. At the far end, in the main yard, he could see Crowley yelling at his men. He turned to Mara. "Get to the loft. Watch my back. If he—" "I know," she said, her voice low and fierce. She grasped his arm, her fingers biting into his muscle. "Be swift, Finn, for Tahoe." "For Tahoe," he repeated. She vanished up the ladder into the hayloft, a shadow moving into the shadows. Finn took a breath. He pulled the packet of papers from his shirt, the telegraphs, the stranger's signed agreements he had stolen from Crowley's desk. He stepped out of the stable's darkness and into the sunlit, terrified yard. "Crowley!" His voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the other shouts. Harlan Crowley spun around, his shotgun still in his hand. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in pure hatred. Finn, you traitorous son of a— It's over, Harlan, Finn said, walking slowly toward him, his hands empty, held away from his body. Your plan fell apart. Your war is a lie. What in hell are you talking about? Crowley blustered, gesturing at the silent ring of warriors on the hills. You see that's an uprising you brought 'em, didn't you? You're an Indian lover. A traitor. I brought them, Finn said, his voice calm, carrying to the nervous, listening gunmen. But they're not here to attack. They're here to watch. They're here for the truth. Just then, a new sound began. A high, thin whistling. A dozen arrows, fletched in black, arced high into the air from the northern ridge, trailing a high-pitched sound. They were not aimed at the men. They were warning shots. They landed, thunk, 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 in the hard-packed dirt of the yard, quivering. Crowley's men flinched, some firing their rifles wildly at the hills. The shots wasted. Hold your fire, Finn yelled. They're not shooting at you. They're just keeping you pinned. At that same moment, a cloud of dust appeared on the eastern road. It was not a rider. It was a wagon, and several men on horseback, riding fast. It's the army, Crowley yelled, his face lighting up with relief. They got my wire. We're saved. Give 'em hell, boys. But as the wagon drew closer, the relief on his face died. It was not a Blue Army ambulance. It was a buckboard from Mesa Crossing. And the men on horseback were not soldiers. It was the sheriff, the blacksmith, and 2 ranchers from town. Riding beside them, his black coat flapping, was a familiar, older man. It was the preacher, the same one from Prospect Hollow, his hair now white, who had moved to the new parish in Mesa Crossing 2 years prior. He had heard the news of the Apache siege and had come, his conscience demanding he be a witness, just as he had been a witness to Finn's confession 12 years ago. They all pulled up at the edge of the ranch, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. Trapped between the silent Apache line and the armed ranch, they were the perfect audience. What is this? Crowley roared, his plan collapsing into a nightmare. This, Finn said, his voice cold, is the truth. He threw the packet of papers at Crowley's feet. This is your agreement with the outlaws from Kansas. This is the bill for the Apache costumes. The gunmen on the wall looked at each other, their rifles lowering, their face filled with doubt. That's, Crowley stammered. That's lies forgery. Is it? Finn said. Then ask the army. They found the body of one of your warriors at the train robbery. A white man, in a cheap headdress. Ask the Millers. Their children are alive because I pulled them from the fire you ordered set. The preacher's eyes went wide. Finian, he whispered, recognizing the orphan boy. Now, a man. Fire, what fire? He did it, Finn said, pointing at Crowley. He hired men to pose as Apache, to rob the train and burn the Miller homestead, just to start a war so he could steal this valley. Just like he stole it from Tahoe. Tahoe, Crowley sneered, his eyes darting, looking for an escape. I don't know any. You do. Finn's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. You shot him, 12 years ago, with that special bore chart rifle you keep in your office. You shot him, and left him for the lions. His father is on that hill, Harlan. He's been waiting. The truth was out, raw and ugly, hanging in the suddenly quiet air. The gunmen stepped back from the wall, their loyalty to Crowley dissolving. The sheriff, his hand on his gun, looked from Finn to Crowley, his face a mask of dawning comprehension. Crowley was cornered. His empire, his reputation, his life, it was all evaporating in the morning sun. He looked at Finn, his face a contorted mask of pure, primal hatred. You, he spat. You are nothing but a stray dog I fed. Turn around. Finian? The preacher suddenly shrieked. Tell us all. Finn turned, just for a second, to face the witnesses, to give them the final word. It's true. All of it. It was the opening Crowley needed. With a desperate roar, he lunged for the shotgun he had leaned against a post. He swung it up, aiming it squarely at Finn's turned back. A sound, faster than a gunshot, split the air. Thwack! A single, black-fletched arrow appeared, as if by magic, in the thick muscle of Crowley's right arm. He screamed, a high, thin sound, and the shotgun blast, meant for Finn's spine, went wild. Blowing a hole in the wooden stable post, Finn spun, his hand flashing to his hip, the Colt appearing in his hand as if it were part of his arm. High above, in the hayloft, Mara stood, her bow still raised, her face a mask of cold, beautiful justice. The chaos that followed lasted only seconds. Iron Elk, as if this were his signal, rode into the yard. He was unarmed, his hands held high. Beside him rode Cale and 2 other warriors, also unarmed. They held only Finn's papers, the evidence. He speaks the truth. Iron Elk's voice boomed, directed at the white men from town. This man murdered my son. This man burned your homes. He is the enemy, Crowley. His right arm a ruin, his face insane with pain and rage. Stumbled back. He saw his men dropping their rifles, raising their hands. He saw the sheriff, his gun now drawn, advancing. He saw the Apache chief, standing in his yard like a king. He was finished. With his left hand, he clawed for the backup pistol tucked in his belt. A last, desperate act. He would not be taken. He would take them all with him. He raised the gun. Not at Finn, but at the crowd, at Iron Elk, at the preacher, at anyone. No, Finn yelled. There was no choice. No time for words. Finn's gun fired. Once, the shot was clean. A single, sharp crack that echoed off the hills. Harlan Crowley looked down at his chest, at the small, dark hole that had appeared. He looked up at Finn, his eyes wide with a final, profound shock. He could not believe it. He could not believe that the stray dog, the boy, had allied with the savages, and that together they had brought him down. He fell backward into the dust of his own yard, his pistol sliding, unfired, from his lifeless hand. Dead silence fell. Then, from the hills, a new sound. It started low, then grew. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of 400 Apache lances, their butts striking the hard earth. In unison, once, twice, and a third time. It was not a war cry. It was a verdict. It was the sound of justice. Delivered. The revenge was over. The men from Mesa Crossing stared, their rifles lowered, their faces pale. They had seen it all. The preacher, his hands clasped, looked from the body of Crowley to the warrior in the hayloft, to Finn, who stood, his gun still smoking. A man of 2 worlds who had, at last, made them one. There was no way they could go back to town and tell a different story. The honor of Tahoe and the honor of the Apache had been restored. Not in blood, but in truth. The death of Harlan Crowley left a vacuum, a sudden, echoing silence in the territory he had ruled with an iron fist. But this time, the silence was not filled by another tyrant, but by something new. In the days that followed, the ranch became a center of negotiation. The preacher, bless his newly opened eyes, had ridden to Mesa Crossing and returned not just with the sheriff, but with a federal agent, a man sent to investigate the railroad's land claims and the Army's botched report on the uprising, with Iron Elk, Finn, and the town elders from Mesa Crossing all present. The truth of Crowley's empire was laid bare. His web of debt and deceit was unraveled. The ranch, built on stolen land and blood money, was officially dissolved. It was divided. A portion was granted, legally, to the cowhands and workers who had been exploited by Crowley for years, giving them a stake in their own labor. The Miller family was given the finest section, a new, well-watered homestead to replace the one they had lost, and the Eagle Beak Valley, the sacred, contested land, was officially and permanently returned to the Apache, its borders guaranteed by federal treaty, witnessed by the very townspeople who had once feared them. Finn was offered a large parcel for himself, a reward for his part in exposing the truth. He stood before the agent, Iron Elk at his side, and he refused it. "I don't want any land that's just for me," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I've had enough offenses. I've had enough of mine." He pointed north, toward the high, beautiful hills. "I'll build a place, up near Ashwind Creek, on the edge of the valley. A trading post, a small ranch, a place where the water is for anyone who is thirsty, Apache or white. A place where goods can be traded, not stolen, a place that belongs to no one, and therefore belongs to everyone." The agent, stunned by the man who wanted nothing, agreed. That evening, as the sun began to set, Iron Elk gathered his people on the mesa. He called Finn to stand before him, the 400 warriors, their lances now peaceful, watched. "The debt of honor is paid," Iron Elk announced, his voice carrying on the wind. "The debt of blood, for Tahoe, has been answered, not by a massacre, but by truth. The debt is finished." He held up the bone necklace, which he had carried since Finn had given it to him. "But the bond is not—" He stepped forward and, for the second time in Finn's life, he placed the necklace over his head. "This is no longer the mark of a debt," the old chief said, his hand resting on Finn's shoulder, a father's hand. "This is the mark of family. You are the man who honored my son. You are the man who saved my people. You are, and will always be. Welcome in my lodge. You are my son." Finn looked at Mara, who stood beside her father, her eyes shining, a proud, bright smile on her face. Their wedding was not a white man's ceremony, and it was not an Apache one. It was both. It was held at sunset, on the very ridge overlooking the valley, the sky a blazing canvas of red and gold and purple. The preacher stood on one side, his open Bible in his hand, a symbol of Finn's past. Iron Elk stood on the other, holding a sacred eagle feather, a symbol of Mara's. Finn and Mara stood between them, holding hands. He was dressed not in a suit, but in clean buckskins, a gift from the tribe. She wore a stunning white doeskin dress, intricately beaded by the women of her family, her hair unbound and flowing. They did not exchange rings. Instead, Iron Elk bound their joined hands with the leather thong of Tahoe's necklace, the bones resting on their clasped fingers. "You have stood between two worlds," Iron Elk said. "Now, you will be the bridge. What God has joined together," the preacher added, his voice thick with emotion. "Let no man put asunder." Finn turned to her. Mara looked at him, her dark eyes open, full of a love so deep it left him breathless. He leaned in, and under the vast, red sky, before all her people and all of his, he kissed his wife. The celebration that followed was like nothing the territory had ever seen. Great fires were lit. The Apache brought venison and roasted corn, and the ranchers from Mesa Crossing, their fear finally gone, brought coffee and flour for cornbread. They ate together, sitting on the ground, sharing stories, the sound of laughter echoing where there had once been only gunfire. And the children, Apache children with their black, shining hair, and the Miller children, their faces scrubbed clean of soot, played. They chased each other, shrieking with laughter, down by the creek, their game lit by the firelight. No one watched them with suspicion. They were watched over by smiling mothers, and by Apache warriors and white cowboys who stood side by side, their rifles finally put away. There was no threat, no danger. There was only the sound of a new generation, beginning, as the fires burned down to glowing red coals, and the stars blazed to life in the black, velvet sky. Finn and Mara slipped away. They walked, hand in hand, to a quiet ledge of rock high above the valley, a place hidden by pines, overlooking the quiet, sleeping world below. They sat, and Finn wrapped a single, thick buffalo robe around both of them, pulling her close. For a long time, they just sat, watching the embers of the fires, their faces bathed in the soft, warm light. The moon rose, washing the valley in silver. She turned to him, her face in the shadow of his shoulder. He looked down, and his heart felt too large for his chest. He saw the firelight dance in her eyes. He saw the curve of her lips. He touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Finn," she whispered, her voice a soft sigh. He lowered his head, and their lips met. The kiss from the storm had been desperate. A discovery. This was a confirmation. It was slow and deep, and it held all the time in the world. It was a kiss of promises kept, of a life begun. He tasted the faint sweetness of the coffee on her breath, the smokiness of the fire in her hair. His hand slid from her face, his fingers tangling in the long, soft fall of her hair. His other arm tightened around her waist, pulling her from beside him to against him. Her body pressed flush to his, until there was no air, no space, no separation left between them. He felt her hands come up, her palms flat against his chest, feeling his heart hammer. Then her own hands moved, one sliding up to cup the back of his neck, her fingers pulling him deeper, the other tracing the line of his shoulders, his back, claiming him as he was claiming her. It was a long, slow, burning kiss that spoke of all the nights of loneliness, of all the years of waiting. It was a heat that started in his chest and spread to every part of his body. He felt her sigh against his mouth, a soft, yielding sound that made his head spin. When they finally, reluctantly, broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, their breathing mingling, their eyes closed. They stayed that way, wrapped in the robe, in the silence, their bodies pressed together, a single, warm shape in the vast, cool darkness. "I dream," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Of children, children with your gray eyes and my people's hair, children who will never have to choose, who will belong to both." "They will," he murmured, his lips against her hair. "They will belong to this valley. They'll grow up speaking both languages, and they won't ever know the fear we knew. They'll never know a day where they have to be afraid because of the blood in their veins." He held her, and he found himself telling her the story, the real, true beginning. He told her about being a boy, about the cold in the stable, about the terror of Fitch. "I was so afraid that night. Mara," he whispered, "when I stole that milk, I was shaking. I thought he would catch me. I thought he would beat me, or throw me out into the desert. I was so afraid of being alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled back, just enough to look him in the eyes, her hand still on his chest, her fingers resting over the bone necklace. She smiled, a slow, soft smile that lit up her whole face. "If you had not stolen that milk," she said, her voice full of a soft, wondrous certainty, "if you had not been that brave, terrified boy, I would not be sitting here tonight. We would not be here. None of this would be—" He looked at her, and he saw the truth of it. His one small act of compassion, of defying the fear, had rippled out, changing the course of all their lives. Below them, in the valley, the 400 warriors were mounting up. They were not a conquering army. They were a people, heading home, in small, silent groups. They began to move, melting back into the high country, toward Thunder Mesa. They fanned out, their dark shapes leaving trails of golden dust in the moonlight. A final, beautiful promise that honor was not just a word, but a living, breathing force. It all started with a poor, lonely boy, a jug of stolen milk, and a dying man. The next week, 400 warriors came for him. They came not to take his life, but to measure his heart. And years later, when the world had grown dark and twisted with greed, they came back to stand at his side and help him set it right. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from. So please, drop your city or state in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider supporting us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.